Okay, can you, this on? Can you hear me? All right, questions before we start? All right, the midterm. 100 points total. Average was 52. That is the lowest I've ever had for an average for one of these tests. So I'll go through the answers for it. But then probably need to have a conversation about why the average is 52, which is, you know, when you count in the number that some people got extra credit, that's less than half. All right. So what I've done is I went through and for the questions is that the yellow is the correct answer. And then what I did is that I took a frequency, like, you know, when you answered it, I went through and I checked the frequency to see, you know, was there some answer that a lot of people got that, you know, got wrong. So the ones that are just in yellow are where more than 50% of people got it right, usually more than 60%. And then the ones in blue is the one where there was a significant number of people who chose that answer. And then there are a couple questions where, you know, a lot of people chose something else. And I looked and I thought, oh, okay, I could see how you could answer it that way. And so those ones are in green. So as we go through, so when they're in green, then what it means is I gave you credit for either the yellow or the green answer going through. So what I do is that, you know, I kind of look and I think and I see, well, you know, was this one kind of patently wrong? That's that, you know, like was this one here? Which of the following is not true about universal healthcare in the 1950s? The American Medical Association opposed universal care. That's, you know, definitely true. So this one, labor union supported it. That's not true. So like in that case, the answer is pretty clearly B. The UK system is most like veterans. Went over that a couple times. Individual mandate was included for adverse selection. Didn't really have anything to do with moral hazard or supplier-induced demand. Which is the following is examples of asymmetric information, and they're all examples. And questions like that, usually if you find there's two of them that look like they're asymmetric information, probably means they're all asymmetric information. Medi-Cal coverage provides, in this case, B and C. So it doesn't really provide care for people over 65. I gave credit though, if you said it, because I basically gave credit to whatever you answer in this one, because I thought, well, okay, I guess technically, if you're over 65 and you know qualify for in nursing home care, then I guess technically it does. So Medi-Cal does. So I gave everyone credit for this question. The reason it was hard for doctors in rural areas is they saw too few patients a day. Which of the following would not be considered a primary healthcare provider? A lot of people said this one, which I was surprised because that's what most people think of as primary healthcare provider. So I wondered, did people not see the not in there? But then quite a few people got it correct. So according to the argument presented in lecture, why were Republicans so unable to repeal the ACA? Is because they wanted to keep the no pre-existing conditions clause. Which of the following is true of Kaiser? Kaiser must see patients. Some people said that they focused on low-income vulnerable populations, but that has not traditionally been what Kaiser did. Oregon one was all about needs and wants. The universal socialized medicine was made not to pass Truman's healthcare plan, but actually to kill Truman's healthcare plan. It was actually just to tie universal healthcare to communism. Which is the difference between a copayment and a deductible? Well, it's this one here. A copayment is a fixed payment for amount of total fee, etc. What's meant by a level of fair premiums, the level that where the expected insurance claims equals the premiums. EMTALA, people without health care being able to get hospital care. Right. That's what happened with EMTALA. Asthma, chronic condition. Model for the ACA was the Massachusetts Healthcare Plan. Concept of physicians seeing themselves as scientists came after the introduction of the Flexner report. So that was after the, advances in medicine that occurred resulted in the principal agent problem because basically doctors became more sophisticated in terms of and being able to do things. Blue Cross Blue Shield, 1930s, decreased government regulation. There was actually more government regulation. Calls to have universal health care for all. No. Suppose your 70-year-old grandmother had a fall, a broken hip. Well, Medi-Cal, if she qualified, because Medi-Cal only covers elderly care if you are you care for the elderly in certain circumstances if you have low income. Which is the following is true about the impacts of the Affordable Care Act. Enrollment in Medicaid has increased in all states. Well, that's not true because some states didn't adopt the Medicaid expansion. Patent medicines became popular because many people in rural areas had no other access to healthcare. Most people got that right. Medi-Cal care during the introduced DRGs to control costs of healthcare. Which is an example of moral hazard, doctors trying to increase unnecessary use of healthcare by their patients. The RAND experiment introduced a small copayment, led to decreased healthcare usage by patients. Oregon 2, all of these things are true. Adverse events became more of an issue in the 1980s because healthcare had become more complex. I mean, other things that made it so is that there suddenly be large data sets where people could identify adverse events, but for the most part, it was healthcare becoming more complex. Rescission refers to insurance companies refusing to pay for treatment because the patient failed to close a pre-existing condition. It's pretty much the definition of rescission. Which is true of medically underserved areas, too few doctors and too few hospitals. Which is the following is true of the relationship between public health. And so this is one where I gave credit for any of them because, the medical care providers work closely with public health to develop a safety net. Not really, but at the same time, I could sort of see where you might think, where someone might think, well, they weren't against it. And so, they would have been supportive of public health. So even though in the way I wrote when I wrote the question, I was thinking is that, well, they didn't work closely with them. I mean, they didn't really work with them at all. But I guess I could see why a lot of people said A, so I gave you credit for it. Infant mortality, it basically is, in this case, these two things. It's a topic that people care about, and it tells us about the efficiency of the healthcare system. So it's a direct and a proxy. Thankfully, most people got this one correct, right, since you did an assignment on it. That was good. What does Medicare cover? Part A covers hospitalizations. If a family member had cancer and was treated at the Mercy UC Davis Cancer Center, UC Davis would be a tertiary care provider. I suppose the researcher finds that healthcare system is too complicated for people. If the health department wants to address this failure of integration of care, then their best option would be, in this case, case manager. And finally, what's true of people who have no insurance? Well, most of them have employment. I also looked at whether or not coming to class matters. And I, in terms of, because I asked you before how often you come to class, and I walked away from that thinking, a lot of people didn't tell me the truth. Because when I looked at it, most people said, "Oh, I always come to class." And I thought, how many people are here today? 2, 4, 6, 8, probably about 20 people here. So that means we've got about a little bit, a third of the class here today. So it's mostly like that. So I can't really say that most people come to class all the time. So it's hard for me to say. What I think, I mean, I don't know. I should ask you. Why do you think that? Yeah, I mean, because it's pretty much a similar type of test that I've given for years. I mean, I change around the questions, but not that much. So it's a pretty similar type of test. Any ideas of how to improve for the final? I have a theory. I think it's because I think that because I put the lectures on YouTube, is that people think, oh, they don't really need to come to class or pay attention because it's on YouTube. And what I worry about is that on YouTube, you don't really process it, right? Because you can kind of just turn it on and watch it. And the thing about any type of information, class, not just this one, but any of them, is that you have to process it, right? I mean, that's why, there was a pretty significant debate when PowerPoint came along, because a lot of people said we shouldn't give PowerPoint slides, because what happens with PowerPoint, because it used to be, I physically would give out copies of PowerPoint slides to people back when when they didn't mind us doing all this photocopying. So I'd give out copies. I wouldn't make them available online, but I'd give out copies, and so people could take notes on them. I thought, well, that's better because then they don't have to go through and actually, they don't have to type it in or write these things out. They can just write notes on the PowerPoint slide. But now what I worry about just putting them online is that there's never any point that people actually process the information. I mean, it's too easy just to kind of read through, especially if I give you a one-page sheet, then it's too easy to read through and then think, oh, I'll just take notes on it at the end. So what do you think? Should we stop giving out PowerPoint slides and just give them out in paper? I'll print them off and give them off in paper for those who come. Or stop putting them on YouTube? What would be helpful? How many would say stop putting them on YouTube versus no, keep them on YouTube? So keep them on. I mean, my problem is that I think that, people who study like it to have it on YouTube because you can go back to it. So that's why I don't want to, kind of punish people who actually want to use it as a learning tool. It sounds weird to say, well, I'm going to make people learn by not giving them much information. That doesn't sound right. Making people come to class? No, this is a university. Can't do that. So anyways, we'll go on as before, but just let you know, I probably won't be as nice on the final. I went through and I gave the grading scale as if this was a final, right? I mean, as if I was forced to give you, and I couldn't, normally would I sit there and give 50% people a 50% of B minus? No. But at the same time, I'm not going to fail 2/3 of the class. So I'll take this as a sign that, lastly, I don't know if redoing the test would help, because really the questions were pretty similar to what they've been in the past. So I'm not convinced that somehow it was a harder test, but I'll take it into consideration when I write the final to try and, make sure it's more direct along the way. But at the same time, I think people should, reconsider studying, how you're studying, and make sure that you're doing it in a way that where you are actually processing the information. Okay, any questions about the final? If you want to go through your final, I mean, your midterm, come to office hours or just zoom in, because, you know, I zoom the office hours. So if you want to just zoom in on the office hours and I'll go through it with you. But it's pretty, you know, it's pretty straightforward. That's that there wasn't like, because there's no open-ended questions. It's like there wasn't much interpretation that went on. So, yeah.
So at like the end semester,
Uh-huh.
how does this reflect in the grade book? Yeah, does that make sense? Like at the end, like how does it give us our final grade with having this?
Well, I would say, so if you ask right now, what's your best indication of your grade? It would be this, right? Because, you know, the assignments are 50 points. The midterm is 100 points. The second midterm is 150 points. So, you know, right now, I would say probably this is probably the best indication of what your grade is. So when the final comes, what I do is I take the final exam and I add in this number points here, and I add in the assignment points, and then I sort of figure out the distribution based on that. So so essentially is that I don't go through and record the letter grades at any time along the way. And if you go back and look at first lecture, I went through in gory detail about how I do the grading. So, you know, you can go back and see that, but essentially it means I just take care of, I keep track of points. Other questions? Okay, the other thing is that, you know, I realize there's a lot of slides, right? There's a lot of information. So that and I do it because there's no book. And so the slides basically, you know, count as the book as well. And I put a couple of readings on for this time. And so, you know, the readings are same thing, is that I'll feel free to ask you about the readings on the final. So I kind of expect you to sort of treat the lecture notes almost like a book as you go through. So if it was me, what I would do is I would, you know, kind of go through and regularly just kind of make up little summaries about what was that, you know, what the important things were in the lecture. Because I don't really ask you, like, I don't really go into ask you about specific details of things usually. It's mostly pretty broad concepts. And then if you look at the terms that I gave you to study by, is that, you know, they pretty much map 100% onto what the questions were. So if you knew the terms and knew kind of what the, you know, thing like what socialized medicine was, is that, you know, it's going to map onto to what the questions are at the final. Good. All right. All right. Well, we can switch gears now. No more about being a doctor. Now it's about, you know, kind of the viability of Medicare and Medicaid. So I'm not sure if you've been following it, but you know, the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson, one of the things that he is, well, he was not well known by anyone before he became Speaker of the House last week. But one thing that, you know, that the thing he was known about is that he was one of the people who in Congress who tried to write the brief to basically, you know, make it so that Trump would stay in office. But the other thing that he's known about is that he's, you know, is one of the advocates for wanting to slash Medicare and Medicaid. So there's going to be a government shutdown in another 2 weeks. I think it's going to be 2 weeks, and they're going to shut it down because what this group of Republicans that's, you know, that Mike Johnson sort of comes from wants to do is that they're saying is that they want to make massive slashes to Medicare and to Medicaid and also to Social Security as well. So one thing they're talking about is raising the age by which you get Medicare from 65 to 70, raising the age that you get Social Security from 65 to 70, and then also coming through it and for Medi-Cal basically, or Medicaid, you know, slashing the eligibility for Medicaid. So, you know, if they got what they wanted in terms of the budget deal, what it mean is that Medicare and Medicaid would be significantly reduced. I mean, we'd probably be talking more about, I don't know, 25 to 30 million people would be without health insurance by the end of that. So why? Why are they doing it? Well, partly it's because there's always been a strain within the Republican Party that didn't like government programs. I didn't like large government programs. So for Ronald Reagan, let's say, right? Reagan was a prime example of this type of view. He would talk about the Canadian system and the UK system derisively, as if these are these government systems, poorly run, doesn't give people what they want, and that what we need to have is this this private system. So the privatization was the thing. So there's always been this kind of not enthusiasm about Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, but mostly Medicare and Medicaid from Republicans throughout. At the same time, there's a problem with Medicare, and there's that we'll talk about. Well, and more generally, there's a problem that all of you are going to face. Not so much me, but all of you are going to face in the near future. So I'm going to give you a basic lesson or a lecture in public finance now. And so show me if you know this. 3 levels of the federal government, right? Federal, state, and local, right? So you know that. So like county is the local, state is California, and then there's the federal government. Main sources of income that come into for tax revenue would be for the federal is income tax. So that's what you pay, right? For states, California, it's mostly income tax. And local, in most places, the way that local counties get their money is through property taxes. They not so much in California, because anyone know why California is different? Close. Prop 13. Yeah, Proposition 13 was passed back in 78, I think it was, where basically what it did is it limited the amount of property taxes that you could to 1% of the value of the property. So if you bought a property in 1975 for $100,000, then your property taxes is what, $100, right? No, $1,000. It'd be $1,000, so 1%. On the other hand, so every year you have to pay 1%. On the other hand, if that property is now worth $20 million, you pay $1,000. So it's like whatever you bought the property at, that's what your property taxes are. If someone else comes and buys that property for 20 million, then they get taxed off the property tax of 1%, 20 million. But if you don't sell it, so people who own lots of property and haven't sold it means that they're paying much less taxes than every place else. It also means that counties can't just come in and raise money, get money to pay for roads or whatever they want to do by going through it and raising property taxes. So what happened in California when Proposition 13 passed is that all these counties suddenly were going to go broke because they just had all the revenue slashed. And so the state went through and said, well, we'll give you money. So the state basically upped their income tax and then gives money to the counties. Well, that's good, except for if there's like down economic times, like there's going to be this year, which means the state this year has a lot less income coming in than last year. So as a result, the state's going to have to do some radical slashing of things. And, and county money is going to be under threat as well, because the state's money comes from income tax, and that they then have to go through. So it's the same thing. I mean, so the states have the same type of problem that you would have, right? If you were working and making $40,000 a year, and suddenly, your boss came through and said, "Oh, hey, this year we're only going to pay you $30,000," then you'd be in trouble, because you would say to yourself, "Uh-oh, I have been used to $40,000, and now that I'm only going to get $30,000, what am I going to do?" So, what you do normally is that you would think either I have to slash my expenses, or I have to borrow money, right? Those two things. Well, that's the same thing for the federal government too, except the federal government has another option. And federal government, and that option is they can basically print money, right? The federal government makes money, so they can go through and that they can, if they can cover their, theoretically, they could cover they run a deficit, they just print more money. All right. So this is the revenues, is how much money came in. So this is 2022, right? So this is for federal revenues was 2.63 trillion. So remember, trillion is 10. Let's see. So trillion is 4.9 trillion. That's 4 0 0 0 0 0, right? Hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillion. So that's how much money then the government brings in taxes. How much money? What's the size of the whole economy? What do you think? If they bring in 4.9, the size of the whole economy is about 18 trillion. About 18 trillion. And they bring in about 4.9 trillion in taxes. So, you can see that that's about what, maybe a little bit less than a third of all of the size of the entire economy goes to government revenue. Government expenses is 6.2 trillion. 6.2 trillion, right, is government expenses. And if you look at I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but if you look at the categories that go here, is that here's Social Security, right? Here's health, income security, which is kind of income payments, national defense, Medicare, and then education, then net interest down here of 475 billion, and then veterans, transportation, and government. So revenue of 4.9, expenses of 6.2. That means that they're bringing in about what? 1.38 trillion less in money coming in. Like this is money coming in, and money going out. So that the difference between those two things is called a deficit, right? It's called a deficit. So every year, so it means that in 2022, we had a $1.3 trillion deficit, which means that the government spent 1.3 trillion more than it brought in. So this is what it looks like, right? So here's your spending over here. Here's your deficit, what the revenue is, and that's what the deficit is. Is that unusual? Well, this shows the amount of deficits over time. So going from the period here all the way through like that. So you notice that in 2000, there was actually a surplus, right? So surplus was right here. That's because when Clinton was in office, is that there was a tax increase, and also there was a booming economy. And so when tax revenues go up, is that, when the economy goes good, then tax revenues go up, right? Because you have to remember is that this $18 trillion is that if you go into a recession, then this maybe falls down to $16 trillion. And if you go into an expansion, then maybe this goes to $20 trillion. So since income is taxed or based upon income, that means that the better the country does, the more income the more revenue that the government gets. Same thing with the state. It's like last year was a banner year for the state. They had a huge surplus because they have a really booming state economy. And when they have a booming state economy, they don't have to spend as much on Medicaid and things like that. And so they had a big surplus. This year, they don't have a surplus. The state economy, the revenues have gone down. And so therefore, the state is facing a deficit this year. But the states can't run a deficit, right? So the state of California can't go out and just borrow money to cover their extra expenses. So they actually have to find the money someplace. They either have to cut expenses, they have to raise more revenue, or they have to, well, what they did do is they have a pot of money that they can draw from. But federal government doesn't do that. So federal government has a difference of, 1.3 trillion, then they can raise the money. How does the federal, well, let me finish this first. So you notice is like here, big increases in the deficit here. Well, you could just track it over time. You could say, well, here's the, there was a mini recession in 2000. Then notice how the deficit goes up here. Deficit goes up because Bush, President, George W. Bush put through a tax cut. Tax cuts tend to increase the deficit, right? Because you're cutting taxes. So you're cutting the amount of revenue that comes in. So you cut taxes, so had an increase, and then big jump here. Why was there a big jump here in 2010? What happened in 2010? Yeah. No. Obamacare actually pays for itself. And when they passed it, they made it so that they put taxes on, for the Affordable Care Act, they put taxes on medical devices and things like that. So actually Obamacare didn't really add to the deficit. Now, this was that the big recession of 2010 hit. And that, the economy almost goes into a depression. And so when you hit a big recession, they spend money because the government's trying to support people's incomes. So then it gets better. And then here you go. And then suddenly there's the Trump tax cuts kind of hit here, and then COVID hits. And so when COVID hit, the government was basically just giving out money. So is that bad that the government runs a deficit like this when COVID hits? No, not necessarily. I mean, if you think about what they did in COVID, is that you had a free fall, right? A free fall of everything. Like businesses just stopped. So if they hadn't stepped in to do anything, then you would see massive numbers of businesses go out of business. And that's bad, because it's hard for businesses to start up again. So if GM goes out of business, it's hard for GM just to kickstart and become GM again. So, it's generally seen that during recessions, during bad things that happen, is that there is a role for government to come through and do that. But the idea is that in good times then, is that you want to pay it off. So maybe like in good times, in bad times, that yes, you're going to spend this money, like here if you have a recession, or here if you have COVID. But the idea is that in these other periods is that you should be running a surplus to pay it off. And the reason is, well, first off, so how does the government raise this money? So they're $1.38 trillion short. So how do they raise the money? They can, but they don't. Well, I mean, not directly. How do they raise the money? They sell treasury bonds. So treasury bonds are, the treasury of the U.S. Treasury. They, they're the ones who have to raise the money to pay off the bills. So what happens is that the treasury comes through and that they have $1.3 trillion in deficit. So they sell these bonds. And these bonds say that, people buy the bond. Like, if you have an investment, a retirement account, typically you have government bonds in the retirement account. So what that means is that the government is selling, like sometimes they're 30-day bonds, sometimes they're 60-day bonds, sometimes they're 120-day or a year bond. They sell these bonds, people give them the money, and then in return, you get back. So if you buy a bond for $1,000, right, for a year, what do you get back at the end of the year? You get your $1,000 back plus interest, right? You get your some interest rate. So you get interest rate back at the end of the year. So that's what the government does. Government looks at the interest rates. Government looks at how much money they have to to spend, and they say, well, we have $1.3 trillion that we have to raise right now because we're short. So what we do is we go out there and sell treasury bonds. Who buys the treasury bonds? The investors, like, what do foreign countries buy treasury bonds? Yeah, China buys a lot of treasury bonds. So why does China buy treasury bonds? Well, if you think about, if you go over here to Target and look at all these products, and all these products are made in China. So what does that mean is that they're being made in China, and that China then brings them over here, sells them, and they get sort of, US dollars for their treasury, for their goods. So what does China do with the money then? They have all these US dollars. Well, they could go and turn it back into Chinese yuan or whatever it is, turn it back into the Chinese currency, and then go buy things in China, right? But they don't want to do that because if they did that, then the value of the Chinese currency goes down. And so it hurts their economy. And so what the Chinese government does is that they basically take part of this money that's, this US dollars, and then they buy things in the US. So they buy, buildings, and they buy treasury bonds and things like that. So they use it for other purposes. So a lot of countries buy US treasury bonds, and then because they want to, they have US dollars from things they sell, and then what they want to do is they buy things in the US, or they buy things other countries with the US dollars. So that's why when they talk about the US dollar being kind of the primary currency in the world, that's the reason why. That's the biggest economy, and all these countries will get these US dollars because they, sell things here. And so then they turn around, and rather than converting it back into their currency, they go and they buy stuff with it. Okay. So then there's the debt. And so what the debt is the debt is the accumulation of all of the deficits. So if you think about, like, this year they have $1.3 trillion in debt, right? In deficit. That means they owe $1.3 trillion. But last year, they also had a deficit. And so what happens to the deficit from last year? Well, they still owe, right? In fact, here, I even put together a little slot, because I got obsessive about this. I put together here it is, an Excel file to show you. So let's say that your income was $40,000 and your expenses were $47,000. Okay. So that means that you're 7,000 in the hole. So if you're 7,000 in the hole, from a year, what can you do? Well, you could either get more money. It's one thing to do, right? Try and get a raise. You can go through and try and cut your expenses. So from $47,000 down to $40,000. So you could try and balance your budget, or you could borrow the money. So let's say you borrowed the money and you borrowed $7,000, and let's say interest rates are 6%. So interest rates are 6%. That means that you're going to spend $420 on the money you borrow. And at the end of the year, then you owe $7,420, right? Because you borrowed $7,000. You have to pay a 6% interest rate on it to borrow the money. And so you owe $7,420 at the end. So next year, year two, start the same thing. Start with $40,000. Is that you spend $7,000, so you owe another $7,000, right? You're short again. So what do you do? Well, you can go borrow that $7,000. So you borrow that, and now, but you also have the money from last year, the $7,000 from last year that you owe. So now you owe $14,000, plus you owe all the interest on this now. So you owe $15,000 by the end of the year. Then next year, $7,000 again. You borrow the $7,000. You still have the $15,000 that you started off with owing. So now you owe $23,000, and so you can continue on. And so at the end of year 10, you owe about $100,000, and of that $100,000, about 14% of it is just interest payments. And if interest rates go up to, let's say if interest rates went up to 8%, Now, whoops, see, now you can't see it. Now what would happen is that your amount of money you goes up, you owe goes way up. And now you, about 20% of what you owe is interest payments. On the other hand, if interest payments goes down to, to 1%, then the amount that you owe is only $73,000. So interest payments really, really important. What were interest rates in the US up until last year? Generally, about what were interest rates for government bonds? They're about zero. That means that the government and companies were, because during the recession, what happened is that they basically said to all these banks and everyone else, you can borrow money at zero interest rate. So a lot of banks and people bought money at zero interest, borrow money at zero interest rate, because if the interest rate's zero, right, then it means that your amount that you owe is just basically just what you borrow. You don't owe anything else. But if the interest rate is 10%, then suddenly you owe a lot more. So they really care about the interest rate. What's the interest rate now? On like home mortgages, it's about 8%, something like that. So it means that the government has, right now, they have about $30 trillion in deficits and in debt because of all the accumulation of all and just so we're clear, this amount here, the accumulation, that's the debt, right? The deficit is what you are short in a given year. It's always 7,000 in this example. The debt is the accumulation of it all. And so that's why if you never pay off if as a country, if you don't pay off your debt when times are good, then you're just going to keep on accumulating more and more debt. And so that's pretty much what the US has done. That the US has gone through, and you can see is that, you have a blip here. Why did you have a blip there in terms of the debt? What happened in the 1940s? Yeah, World War II. So you'd think that in wars that yes, you're going to have an increase, but then it stayed kind of constant for a long time. But then you see, this is where Reagan comes into office, and Reagan implemented huge tax cuts. And so you start to see the deficit climbing. Then you have this drop when Clinton came in office because it starts to pay it off. But then this is the Bush tax cuts goes up, and then you have COVID, and then it goes really, really up. So it goes up to about $30 trillion, $31 trillion is owed. That means that all of us owe, so we not only have $1.38 trillion every year that we're short, that we owe basically, right? Because we're the ones who ultimately have to pay it off. We're not only owe $1.38 trillion, we owe $30 trillion, $31 trillion. So the deficit versus the debt, right? Deficit is basically the accumulation, deficit is what you owe every year, what you're short every year. The debt is the accumulation of all those things. So if you look and you think, well, all right, so what can we cut, right? If we wanted to balance our budget, what would we cut? Well, let's go back and look at this thing here. So $1.38 trillion is what we're short. So if we say, well, these are expenses, so let's go through and cut something. So what would we cut? Well, we'd have to get rid of all of Social Security, and that still wouldn't do it. So basically, all of Social Security and health would have to go. What if you just said, we want to cut defense? 800 trillion takes you part of the way there, but not all the way. So you can see is that, there's a problem, because it's not like you can just go through, they're going to shut down the government. They've done this before. They're going to shut down the government. They shut down the parks, national parks, things like road construction stops, all these different things stop. And what happens is that people get upset, and also Social Security checks stop. All these other things kind of end when the government shuts down. And so then people get upset because they say, hey, politicians, don't sit there and shut down everything just because you can't come to an agreement. And so then it starts to kind of momentum will build. Actually, the thing that really, like the last shutdown was 2 years ago, 3 years ago when they shut it down before. And the thing that really opened it back up is that they shut it down right before a holiday. And of course, when they shut it down, air traffic controllers are all got federal employees. And so they cut back on the air traffic controllers. And so it meant that only emergency flights are going out. So essentially right before Thanksgiving, they're going to have a government shutdown. And so potentially it means that airports are going to come and say, well, all that holiday travel, sorry, no more, no airline flights this year because they're shutting it down. And then Christmas, same thing. So that's why, even though they're going to shut down the government, the expectation is that it's not going to last very long because, people really, really don't like it if they can't fly back for Thanksgiving or fly back for Christmas because there's some shutdown night. But the point being is that those are like, you don't even see those things in there, right? They're somewhere in transportation, in like the other government things, that's national parks. So the things that people really care about, you could cut all that stuff out and it wouldn't even make a dent in this $1.38 trillion. Okay. So the other way to look upon this is that you can look upon the debt as a percentage of GDP, because what GDP is income, right? GDP means how much money do we all make? And so right now we owe about 120% of our income. So what that means is that even if they took all the money that we all make this year and said, no one's going to be able to buy any food, housing, anything else, everything is going to go towards just paying off the debt. We still wouldn't pay off the debt because we're over 100%. We owe over 100%. And the other thing to notice is that this interest payment for last year was $475,000 when interest payments were basically 1% or 2%. And so now interest rates have tripled. So this is going to be about more like $1 trillion in interest payments on the debt. So it means that, that we're spending 1/15 of our total income goes just on paying interest payments to the debt. So my little example. So what can you do, or what can we do, right? What can we do as a country to get out of this? Well, to get rid of the deficit, you either have to make more money, you have to, or you have to lower your expenses. Right? Those are your two, get more money in or cut your expenses. Those are your two options to basically lower the deficit. The way you can get more money in is that you can either raise taxes or you can grow your economy, right? Because if you can grow your economy, then your tax revenues go up because you have more percentage of your money is going towards taxes, or not percent, but more money comes in as taxes. So that's why oftentimes when they start talking about how we're going to get out of our deficit, the politicians will point to, oh, let's raise our GDP. Let's go through and do things to stimulate the economy. Because the logic is, well, if you stimulate the economy, that then the GDP grows, and so therefore we'll get more tax revenue in. So we'll solve our problem not by cutting expenses, but by just raising income through more tax revenues, but not raising the tax rate. One of the things that Reagan said, and Bush said, and Trump said when they did tax cuts, is they said, oh, well, what will happen is that if you cut taxes, it will actually raise revenue. Because what they said, the theory was that cutting taxes gives more money to rich people, and rich people know what to do with the money. And so therefore your income will grow a lot more. And so actually your tax revenues will go up, even if your tax rates go down. And that has proven to be not true. It'd be nice if it was, because it means that they could just keep cutting taxes and our tax revenue would go up. But it turns out not to be true. Turns out that if you cut taxes on rich people, is that rich people don't necessarily turn around and grow the economy. They do things like buy sports teams and buy super yachts and things like that. things that don't necessarily lead to this increased productivity for the rest of us. Yeah.
It looks like a world war, we win.
Yeah.
What will happen? What will prevent?
Well, if there's a world war, oh, that's a good question. Well, I think that if we won, right, that's called World War II. Right. So after World War II, is that we were pretty much the only place that still had manufacturing, right? Because Europe was bombed out, England was pretty much bombed out. And so the reason why the US economy did so well in the 1950s was because we had 80% of all manufacturing was done in the US and the world. So, yeah. So that's, if you can avoid being blown up in a world war and everyone else that wants to buy your washing machines, is that then, yeah, they'll do well. Probably not something we advocate for. Yeah, you have another, is this another reason to have nuclear war? Okay.
Okay, so like, the country just go bankrupt and then.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is called, well, I mean, Argentina is close right now. So there's been lots of times, what would happen is that the country, so, if the country starts going into real debt, right? They start to, like this thing starts to increase to 30, this starts to increase from 120 up to like 400% of their income. Then what happens is that the way countries get out of it is they literally print money. Because, the country, like we could pay off 30 trillion tomorrow if you just went to the treasury and said the treasury, print up $30 trillion of money. And then you go to everyone that you owed money to, you say, here's $30 trillion, right? That pays it off.
How does that work? Is this like money backed up by like gold?
No,
How do you know?
no, money's backed up by nothing. No, money is just, that's why crypto is such a great thing. Yeah, I mean, because crypto, it used to be that money was backed up by gold, right? And that caused lots of problems because it meant that if your economy wants to grow, is that you have to get more gold to grow your money supply. Because otherwise you have a set amount of money and everyone wants it. And so prices just go up dramatically. And so they got rid of the gold standard back then. Every once in a while you'll hear politicians say, we need to return to the gold standard because what they're trying to do is control inflation. But it's sort of a stupid idea. But no, there's nothing behind it. I mean, money is all money exists is just because, if you think about money, it exists because I'm going to give you this piece of paper and you are going to agree to take it. And what you're trusting is that when you turn around someone else, they're going to accept it. That's pretty much it. And that we can all pretty much, we have something that we agree that we're going to use, but there's no intrinsic value in it, right? There's nothing like, you're not going to use that money. If people don't agree to it, it's not like you say, oh, good, I'm going to take this money then and use it for something. No, it just exists because, this is why crypto from the start, because I sat there and I looked at crypto and I thought, why does crypto have value? Right? Other than, crypto has value because if I buy crypto and I think the price of crypto is going to go up, then it's worth it for me to buy it and then wait till it goes up and sell it, right? That's called gambling, right? That's speculation because all you're doing is you're trying to guess what other people are going to do. And so if you think other people in the future are going to want crypto for some reason, then you buy it now. But what you see with things like crypto is that, it goes like, it does what's called bottom. And that the value goes up and up and up and up and up, and then it just crashes. Because what happens is that all these people are buying, and all the way through, they think there's nothing here. This is just a Ponzi scheme, right? At some point, if at some point it's going to go down, and so when it starts going down, that's when I need to go through and to sell. So what they do is they wait, and once they see it start going down, then everyone sells. And so then the price of crypto just crashes. It hasn't crashed all the way, right? Crypto is still, like Bitcoin is still fairly high. Who uses Bitcoin? Yeah. You use Bitcoin? Excellent. So, but who is it that, I mean, I mean, because you don't need to use Bitcoin, I assume. You could just use regular money if you wanted to. Like when you go into the market, you probably don't pay with Bitcoin in the market, right? So you don't need it as to buy things like in fact, Bitcoin kind of went out of the business of doing that. So now people buy Bitcoin just to hold Bitcoin. So who is it that really uses Bitcoin, that needs Bitcoin? Drug dealers, right? People who do kind of illegal activity. Bitcoin is great for that because it's not traceable. At least it's hard to trace. It's hard to trace. And so it's great for doing that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think from when I look at this, as I think, well, why hasn't Bitcoin gone to zero? It's because there's always this sort of group of people who want to use it for illicit activities. And as long as it has some positive value, that they can continue trading like that. But, and it is good for drug dealing. And it is good for money laundering, so which is a positive thing. But at the same time, you're not going to see like what they used to talk about Bitcoin as like all the stores would start taking Bitcoin and we'd be able to go to McDonald's and use our Bitcoin in McDonald's and things like that. And in fact, this Sam Bankman-Fried, you've been hearing about, been following this. Well, it's a big trial that's going on right now, where this guy is you must be following this. Do you know who I'm talking about? Sam Bankman-Fried, guy with wild hair. What he did is that he ran a company. And that this company, what it was set up to be to basically you could put your money, your regular dollars in there, right? Put your regular dollars in there, and then it would buy the Bitcoin. But then whenever you wanted to convert it, you'd come back and say, okay, I want to sell my Bitcoins, and they would have regular dollars there. So it was this important thing because it meant that, like, if you had $1,000 and you wanted to buy Bitcoin or a little piece of the Bitcoin, you could go to them and you could give them your $1,000 and that you buy a Bitcoin. And if the price of Bitcoin went up to $2,000, then you could go back to them and say, okay, I want my $2,000 now, right? And what the deal was that they were going to be like a real safe, they would have the money backed up by someone, but the real money would be backed up by something. So the idea was they would pay this money and they would put it in, treasury bills or whatever it was going to be, just something that would be safe so that your money would actually be there if you ever wanted to come back and get it. That was the idea. Turns out that what he was doing is he was taking the money and he had invested in another company. He put it all into another company called Elysium, something like that, into this other company. That was what he was going to be backed up with. And the other company had his own cryptocurrency. And this cryptocurrency was one he just made up. So that he then took the money and just, the real US dollars and spent it on, mansions and travel and everything else. And then and then on the books then, it looked like it was all in this company. This other company was all backing it up. The other company was just nothing. So that's why when the price of crypto fell, and that suddenly all these people started coming back and saying, hey, I want to turn in my crypto and get back real money, is that there was no real money there. All the real money was gone. And so he could only say, well, here, you can have my crypto instead. And so that's where it all went south. So no, I don't have crypto. And no, I wouldn't recommend you buy crypto unless you're a drug dealer. And so if you're a drug dealer or you want to move arms into third world countries, then yeah, then it's a pretty good thing. But I think for the rest of us, I'm going to guess that we're not actually going to. Okay. So we're talking about, so the US government is in debt, has a deficit and has a debt. Is that always bad? So is it always bad for you to have a debt, you as an individual?
Now the government is thinking about like how do I raise the taxes or civil the long-term effects of having a debt?
Well, you as an individual, do you have debt right now? No? Does anyone here have debt? What do you have debt for? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. And does anyone have any other money that they owe? Like student loans, right? So you're going into debt over student loans. What else? Car payments, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that going off what she said, even like when you take out loans from mortgage,
Mhm.
that would be also like good debt.
Good debt, why? Oh, you mean mortgage, like a home mortgage?
Correct.
Yeah. So home mortgage is good debt. Student loan, good debt? I mean, how do you know whether a student loan is good debt? Depends on what, I mean, traditionally, getting an undergraduate education meant that it was, like the most valuable thing that you could do in terms of raising your future income. So that's traditionally it's been that way. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people are souring on it now, but it still seems to be as that, if you look at people's long-term income with college degrees or not, college degrees goes like this. Other people go like that. Well, they go like that, right? They start higher but then they flatten out. That typically is the way so that's why it's always been seen that college degrees were a good investment, because it's worth it to go into debt here because you're gonna be on that path rather than that path there. That's the argument. On the other hand, if you, when we talked about medical school and we said medical school, you run up like a Caribbean medical school, $300,000 in debt. So there, what you're hoping is that you're going to end up like this, right? Way up here on the doctor's scale. But the problem is that if you have all this debt and then you don't graduate medical school, then you're on one of these two trajectories. And so then you owe a whole bunch of money that, for a doctor to pay off their $300,000, they can do it. But for you and me to pay off $300,000, much tougher to do. So that's why people who start medical school and then drop out are screwed. Not screwed, but they're in trouble because they can have all this income, this debt, but they're not on this high income path. So therefore, your student loans in theory is an investment, right? And that what you're doing is you're taking a chance and you're saying, I'm going to borrow all this money and go into debt. And that in return for that, I think I'm on this path here. That's what I'm going for. Home, buying a home, good investment. Depends, right? Depends when you buy a home and where. Yeah. So a lot of people in the mid 2000s, because what you hope when you buy a home is that the price isn't going to go down. You hope that, that your price, because, if you're paying what, $1,200 a month, something like that in mortgage, in rent, and your mortgage is $1,700 a month, something like that. You're hoping that what you're going to do is that this $1,700 is going to help you buy a house, and so therefore you're paying all this extra money as a way of saying that you're going to in the future you own this house, and so therefore the house will be worth a lot more, and so you'll get this asset, and it truly has been. I mean, if you look at the case for reparations for African Americans, the case for reparations. I mean, one of the direct consequences that you can look at for how African Americans were screwed is that during the 1970s and 1960s and 50s, there were a lot of home loans that were made that were given to people, but they excluded African Americans. And so as a result, is that was a major way that people got income or got wealth is by owning this home that then went up in value. So the idea is that if you can own a home that goes up in value, then that's great. What happened during the Great Recession, right back in 2008, is that home prices through the 2000s were going And if you look at the house prices, right, house prices were going like that from 2000 to 2000, and they were going up. And so if you have a house that was sort of worth like this amount, that your mortgage was that amount, it looked like you had made a lot of money. In fact, when we bought our house up in Mariposa in 2011, we bought it for $322,000 for this house. 2 years before, the couple that owned it had been offered $880,000 for the house, and they turned it down because they wanted to get up to $900,000. So that's a case where, did they own an $880,000 house? No, they owned a $322,000 house, but there was a housing bubble, so that it looked like all these housing prices were really, really high. But really, then what happens is that they crashed, right? They crashed back in 2008. So the housing prices, like, you can see it here in Merced, big housing boom in the mid 2000s, then just sort of crashed in 2008, and housing stopped because it went like this. All these houses were being built with the expectation that they're going to get $500,000 for it, and suddenly the houses are selling for $200,000. So everything stopped. So for them, for the people that we bought it from, they built the house, so they weren't out money, but they definitely were sad because they thought in their minds they had gotten used to the idea that they had an $800,000 house, and they didn't have an $800,000 house. But what a lot of people did is that they were told by mortgage brokers is that, oh, look at your house is worth $800,000, and you only owe $150,000 of it. So therefore, you've got $650,000 in equity in your house. So why don't you borrow the money? So people borrow, they might borrow up to, let's say, up to $700,000 or up to $500,000, let's say. Right. So now that their mortgage is there, because they think, well, I still own that, the house in price is just going to keep going up. But what happens is that then when the housing prices crash, now they owe $700,000 on their house, and the house is only worth $200,000. So that's why there were so many foreclosures during the 2008 recession, was because all these people have been told that, oh, you can borrow money because you have all this equity in your house. And so that's why homeownership's a good thing if it's going like that. Homeownership's not a good thing if you buy here and then it goes there, because then you're always going to be, you owe $700,000, even though your house is worth $200,000.
So what if they took that money and bought another property that was worth that big of money? So
yeah, it's a good question. What if they took this money and bought another property, which is what a lot of people did, right? A lot of people, they might take their because at the time, you probably were too young to remember this, but I remember being in the market, and I was standing there buying milk, and there were this woman and this man who were younger, sitting there talking, and they're talking about flipping homes. They were talking about how, yeah, I'm going to flip this home, and I'm going to buy this thing. I remember sitting there thinking to myself, these people, I don't think know anything about flipping homes, and they're sitting in the market talking about this. I said, housing market's screwed. It's going to crash soon. Because what happens is that, people start borrowing money and think, hey, I'm going to go ahead and I'll buy a house for $300,000, or I'll buy a house for $1 million, right? I'll borrow $500,000. I'll put in $500,000 I borrow. I'll put in $500,000 here for this $1 million house. So now I owe $500,000 here, and I owe the $500,000 there. And then if this housing price goes up on another, this housing price goes up, then you think, oh, I've got more money, so they borrow it. So people can easily go through and just borrow more and more and more. But then when housing prices crash, it crashes here, but it also crashes here, and it crashes to the other property as well. And so they end up owning not just 500,000, they end up owning $1 million, or owning 2 million, or So that's where people got screwed. We're not screwed, but I mean, that's why, you see housing prices that do this, they go up and then they crash. And when they crash, there's suddenly all these foreclosures and then they stay pretty low for a while. Because all these people are now all in debt and it takes a new group of people to come through and get rich off Bitcoins and buy houses. Yes.
What about, that already know the recession? What about the for investors or people who are working to pick up that, so it's more low pricing? People with like high amount of money, they are in purchase of some properties that, I don't know, they have an increase.
Like now, is it worth now to buy properties?
Right now, probably because, it's hard to how long they can keep them like that.
Yeah.
And so, if there's a different crash again, most people might go for it and, got a low price and see if they can get rid of that. But,
Maybe. I think it's hard to predict. Because, you could say, well, the housing price is going to keep going up now, right? Because 2008 and the housing prices have gone up. But you can also sit there and say, well, housing prices may not go up. And so all it takes, it was bad during this period because banks got in there and started loaning people who shouldn't have borrowed $500,000. They started loaning them money. And then they would then go ahead and loan them an extra 500,000. And so banks were culpable in terms of all this. I don't know if banks would do that now. So I don't know if it'll be the same type of cycle that was back then. But even so, it's risky, right? Because you're talking about losing lots of money if you buy, if you start doing this and it goes south on you, then you're, Okay, I think we're out of time. So go buy properties. And next time, cash in some of your Bitcoin and bring it in sort of give us all a bit, share the wealth a bit. The love, share the love.